Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Jade Black and today I'm here with another episode of Adventures Elsewhere Reviews, the spoiler-free book review show. So, you are probably wondering why this video has subtitles. The author of this book, I know, wanted to be able to watch this video, but has issues with video without subtitles. So I wanted to be inclusive. This is not going to become a habit simply for the sake of I do not have the time nor the resources to do this for every video. That is the reality of this being just one of dozens of plays that I spent. I've known about this one for a while. I was offered an ARC by the author very kindly, and I said sure, why not, because I'd read a short story by this author. Yeah, I thought I'd take a punt on this one. This is Bound by Heart by Midnight Rose. This is a fantasy book. I would call this adult fantasy, but not in the sense that it's inappropriate for younger readers, but it's clearly written for adults and with adult readers in mind. Goodreads says this one is 130 pages. This one is self-published and I read the ebook for this one. If you've been around here before, you know the drill. I like to give my overall impression of a book in 3 words at about this point. This one, easy. This one is emotional, it's philosophical, and it also has this mythical feel. So our main protagonist for this one is Ryder. Ryder is a young man with an interesting perspective on life. A very philosophical man. He's a real thinker. He thinks about things a lot. He almost kind of rejects that he's a person. He's very unhappy to be a person, which is... it's hard to explain without reading the book, but it makes him an extraordinarily interesting character to read about. He has interesting views on things like the inherent magic of the world and therefore his place within it, and just on people and morality and all sorts of things. We spend a lot of time with Ryder just on his own steam in this book. We don't actually meet really anyone until later, but Calith's presence looms quite heavily, especially in the first half, and Calith is somebody that is from Ryder's backstory, who he has somewhat lost contact with. It's hard to say much about Calith without spoilers though, so we're going to move on to Fergo instead. And Fergo is a feather dragon, and is very, very young. Fergo naturally shares quite a lot of similarities with Ryder, in the sense that they're both kind-hearted and compassionate, Ryder to an absolute fault. Compassionate to his detriment at points. They're quiet people, they very naturally get along. It's a very natural, very genuine, very serendipitous kind of friendship, family relationship. It's very interesting with them. And there's also Rylissa, who only has a brief amount of page time, but she's interesting in her own right because she has been raised incredibly isolated. So her perspective, her ignorance of a lot of things is fascinating in its own right. And she's the sort of person where you can imagine that despite everything, she has a very important role to play in the wider connected stories of this land. The pacing of this book is very interesting to me, because at points it's very, very slow, but that's almost the point. This to me is where a lot of the myth, sort of almost fairy tale feel comes from with this one. The point of the story at points almost isn't the story itself, it's sort of its own existence at a point. And that's interesting to read. This to me has a very similar feel. Wild pull. This has a similar feel in this way to the Queens of the Stone Age album In Times New Roman, where they simply do not care about mixing conventions or anything like that. There is absolutely no mind paid to these things in that album. They say, we want you to hear the guitar a bit more at this point in the song, so we're turning it up. And we want this part to take this instrument, this vocal line, this to take more of a stand here. So we're turning this up, even though every mixing convention anywhere will tell you that is the wrong thing to do. This book has that same feel of just, this is what the point is here, so this is what we're going to focus on. Yeah, there are other things happening and there's story happening in the background, and all of that's still there and still moving and still relevant. But this is the thing we're focusing on. It's a very different feeling book because of that. It's very unapologetic, I guess is the word I'm looking for. The one thing I will say, pacing-wise, is some of the chapter breaks are a little odd to me. I find this with quite a lot of books, so it's not something I mention much. But some of these did feel particularly odd. That is just a taste thing, though. The writing quality on this one is really high. There's so much done here in terms of the feel, the tone of the book. It makes no mistake, this is equal parts epic fantasy, myth, and fairy tale. Honestly, fairy tale feel to me is huge in this one. I described this one on Goodreads, and I stand by this, as a sort of sombre modern fairy tale. That's exactly what it feels like. It feels like a fairy tale that's written for a modern audience with topical issues, nothing specific necessarily in mind, which I think also adds to that. It's somewhat timeless despite all that, and that's very, very hard to do. Props to the writer big time on this one. And there are some clever tricks with spelling too, so that's neat. The world building and lore aspect on this one I also found impressive, because this is an alternate world. It's a very rich world. There are dragons, there's magic, there's all sorts going on, there are palaces. There's almost like some Ryder isn't overly aware of how the governmental system works, or hasn't necessarily experienced much of it, but it does, you get the idea, the impression that there's some kind of feudal government or lots of warring factions or something going on. There is an impressive amount of world building and lore in this book. And the thing that's impressive about it is that it doesn't get bogged down in it. There's an amount of stylistic, okay, we need to explain this a bit more, but it does it so nicely that even I don't mind. I enjoyed reading those passages. That's rare. Like, getting the amount of world building and lore that there is in 130 pages in its own right, which by the way includes all of the front and back matter and whatnot. Impressive. Doing it without having it bogged down outside of a few stylistic moments that honestly don't even sag. Impressive. So the themes in this one, you can imagine by the title. It's not surprising for me to say the themes in this one. The big one is love, but not in a romantic sense at any point. Honestly, it's a lot of platonic and sort of very family feel love, the idea of family and found family, but not in like the really trite way that you see all the time, where it's, oh, you're the brother I wish I had or whatnot, which, can be nice. But it's the sort of found family that's kind of undefined, that feels a lot more naturalistic, whereas, yeah, we're family, but you don't have a particular role, you're not a father figure or a brother figure or a cousin, but you're a family member, in a way. And something like that is a lot more genuine than anything else. Like, despite Ryder and Fergo's circumstances and how their relationship originated, it very quickly just becomes quite equal in a way that I didn't expect. There's also a lot of, this isn't quite the right phrasing just because of how that world is set up, but love for just general humanity, love for the world itself, love for nature itself. That's interesting to read about. It's very rare, I feel like, to come across something like that. Slavery is also a big part of this book, especially in the beginning, and the sorts of things that Ryder has experienced and fought against. There's also vows and promises are a very big thing, and something that has tangible weight and tangible meaning, which again is something I feel a lot of books that say they're about vows and promises lack. So that's refreshing. It's nice to read. It's not, these things coming together as well makes a lot of sense. It all meshes together very nicely. What's particularly interesting about this book is the amount of spiritualism that's in it. I like reading about spiritualism. I really do. It's something that, it has meaning, it's something I think about. I'm not going to go into tons of detail about this, but I mean, there's a lot of spiritualism that Ryder has, that Ryder thinks about in the way that that's all on the page. I really appreciate how all that's done. I really enjoyed that. That's something that meant something to me. And what's interesting about this is that also, at a couple of points, there are some very clear Christian elements, Christian allegories, which, the reason I'm mentioning this particularly is because it's not uncommon, especially in horror senses, for something like Christianity or witchcraft or whatnot to show up in some form or another. I've read books, other genres of books, where faith and Christianity and all these things are important, Western books, it's something that comes up. This, however, is the first book where all of this stuff has come up and actually felt spiritual. It's the first time I've ever read about Christianity in any way, and it's had any kind of spiritual tie to it. And that to me is fascinating, because it almost makes me wonder why I haven't come across that before. Religion without spirituality is a very odd thing to me. Reading religion with actual spirituality tied to it, I find refreshing, I find interesting. And despite all of this, one thing I really admire is the book doesn't shy away from some quite questionable lessons that can be inadvertently learnt as well. And there are points where you think, Ryder, I'm really not sure about that. One particular thing that I think is very clever in this book that I've not come across before. So the first thing you come to after the front matter of this book is a prologue. It's not labelled as a prologue, but that's quite clearly what it is. It reads to me like a myth. It very, very much feels like a myth, and it's a great scene setter to the story in that sort of a way. Honestly, that whole story, that whole myth in brief form, I would read that entire story, that entire quest in full, having read that. What's also very clever about this, though, is that it accounts for you skipping it. There was some sort of early repetition from the prologue, and I thought, well, I've just read the prologue, what's the point of that? And then I thought, oh, but if you skip the prologue, that's why this is here. And I respect that. Personally, I find it a bit sad that authors feel the need to do this. I do think it's a little sad to actually see something like that in a book. I completely get it, I completely respect it. It doesn't detract, because it's all handled over and done very quickly, and handled very well by this author, but I've talked about the tone a fair bit. I've talked about it being sombre, I've talked about it being spiritual, I've talked about it feeling like a fairy tale and like a legend. All three of those things can and are, at points, true simultaneously. There are some very sombre sections, there are some very spiritual sections in their own right, there are some very fairy tale-like sections, but they do all overlap quite a lot. It just feels very unique in that way. It's a super unique book. I have so many favourite moments, but you know, I can't have this episode go on for 6 hours. So there are two sequences where Ryder travels through a cave. This is something I don't feel like you see very much of in fiction anyway. You see a lot of caves in video games to the point of I actually kind of hate cave levels in video games, especially fantasy games, because it's so overdone. But it's not something you see much of in books, at least not the books that I've read. So seeing that and it being actually quite gripping, the journey back isn't montaged over or basically identical. That was interesting to read from a craft perspective as much as from a reader perspective. Meeting Rylissa, the meeting with her, I mean, to be honest, all the conversations with her were interesting, but the meeting with her was interesting just from a sake of two fundamentally different perspectives on the world clashing very strongly from the outset. That was interesting. There's also a big full circle moment in this book that I feel like you could miss, but that for me was almost like icing on the cake. As you might imagine, you can imagine a lot of art coming from this as well. So, description of the valley, it's a very picturesque place. It's the sort of place that I like to draw. So as you can imagine, yes, there are mountains. It's one of those a lot packed in a small space locations that I really like. Also, Ryder has a diamond-shaped scar on his palm. That was one of the really early ones. Naturally, for me as well, spirits, visions, things like that. The things like that to me are always just begging to be put on the canvas. I really like drawing spirits and ghosts and things like that, so I could go on, I could talk for a very long time about this book, but this is an easy 5-star for me. This is such a completely unique read, a completely different take on fantasy than anything I've ever read, a completely different take on a lot of things than I've ever read. Skillful book, skillful writer, super underrated. Link in description, get your hands on it. I'm a certifiable fantasy hater and I freaking love this. So this to me is the aberration of fantasy. If you were going to read one horror novel in your lifetime, make it Nick Ripley's Aberration. If you're going to read one fantasy novella in your time, make it Bound by Heart. If you are a fellow writer and you have an ARC you would like to send my way, there is a cheat sheet at the very end of this video that will give you 95% of the information that you need. I am a little bit picky about what I will take. I wouldn't ordinarily take fantasy, for what it's worth. There is also a full information video. There is a form in the description for you to send your books through. To be honest, you could just email me. Don't stress about it overly. If it sounds like the sort of book I want to read, then I'll want to read it. So until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day, and happy reading.